Frank Lloyd Wright was the master of the Prairie school movement of architecture, which he himself called organic architecture, in harmony with its owners and its environment. In 1991, the American Institute of Architects named him the greatest American architect of all time. I had the idea to use a Frank Lloyd Wright coffee table book for my first slide. There are many to choose from because Frank is famous and his buildings are ideal photographic subjects. So here are several on a coffee table in a Frank Lloyd Wright house. Frank was born in Wisconsin. His mother was Anna Lloyd Jones, and his uncle was Jenkin Lloyd Jones, a major figure in Midwest Unitarianism. Frank's father had been a Baptist minister, but had converted, and Frank was a lifelong Unitarian. According to Frank, his mom always wanted him to be an architect. She tore pictures of English cathedrals out of magazines to decorate his nursery. That's probably true. It's very plausible. But you know, it's also the kind of story that gets invented for autobiographies. His mother bought a set of Froebelgaben blocks from Philadelphia's Centennial Exhibition, and it became one of Frank's favorite toys. Frank's father was not a financial success. I mean, you know, the poor man was trying to make a living as a Unitarian minister. Frank's mom asked the father to leave. The parents divorced in Frank's teens, and he never saw his father again. Frank changed his middle name from Lincoln to Lloyd, showing where his loyalties lay. I will mention here and get it out of the way that Frank himself would rack up 3 marriages and multiple scandals. In addition to having mistresses and abandoning a wife and children, there were murders. In 1914, a manservant went crazy. He set Frank's house on fire and axe murdered 7 people, including Frank's mistress, Marna Cheney, and her 2 children, before committing a slow and painful suicide by drinking acid. In a different fire, Frank lost Japanese prints worth up to $500,000. He left his second wife after 1 year due to her morphine addiction. He and a mistress were once arrested on charges brought by the mistress's husband, who wanted his daughter back. I'll say no more, but I might read his full biography someday. I guess it would not be dull, even more lively than the fictionalized biography of Frank that Ayn Rand's Fountainhead. But let me get back to architecture. At age 20, Frank went to Chicago to work as a draftsman for Joseph Lyman Silby, who mentored Frank and other future Prairie school architects. Frank didn't have a degree, but Silby had worked with him on Unity Chapel, which was built for Frank's uncle Jenkin. Silby may have hired Frank for his connections. After Frank joined the firm, Silby also built a church and a school for the Lloyd Jones family. Frank learned fast. In a year, he joined another firm, Adler and Sullivan, and by age 23, he was head draftsman. He married, got a loan from his boss, and built this house for himself and his new wife. I can see the influence of those childhood Froebel blocks. It's not yet full-on Prairie school, but it's impressive for a 23-year-old's starter home. You know, maybe too impressive. Frank lived high, and as a young man, he was always strapped for cash. He filled the gap by taking bootleg commissions outside the firm. His clients requested traditional styles, like this Queen Anne home, but the building still had Frank's traditional clean lines. Too much so, actually. His boss saw one house, knew that Frank must have designed it, and fired him. Frank opened his own firm. This is Frank's first house as an independent, the Winslow House, 1893. It's not fancy, but nice clean lines. They impressed Daniel Berman, arguably America's leading architect. He was director of works for the Chicago World's Fair and architect for New York City's Flatiron Building. Burnham offered to finance Frank for 6 years of study in Paris and Rome. Frank said no. Frank would go his own way, working with nobody but his own disciples and with no design principles but those of his own creation. The Ward Willets House is the first mature example of Prairie style, described as, quote, a rectangular central space with a rectangular wing projecting from each side of that space, low roofs, and elements that run parallel to the ground and extend out beyond the frame of the house. The plan of the house is a windmill style, 4 wings extending from the fireplace in the central core, and the movement from each wing being along a diagonal line, unquote. Let's look at a few more of Frank's landmarks. The Larkin Administration Building, 1903, noted for its interior innovations. Air conditioning, built-in desk furniture, and for the first time ever, the hanging walls now seen in almost every public washroom to make them easy to clean. Unity Temple, 1905. I could hardly skip this one in a UU show. This is a Unitarian church. But architects don't skip it either. Some call it the world's first modern building. It is constructed entirely from reinforced concrete. Frank said it was with this building that he ceased to be an architect of structure and became an architect of space. The Second Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, designed from 1911 to 18 and built from 1919 to 23. Frank traveled for long stays in Japan 3 times. This hotel famously survived a major earthquake in 1923, but there was damage to the foundation and the building was demolished in 1967. The John Storer House, 1923, one of 4 so-called textile block concrete houses built in Los Angeles. It is still used, almost 100 years later, as a location by directors who want a futuristic look. Falling Water, 1935. Time magazine called this Wright's most beautiful job, and it's on the Smithsonian's list of 28 places to visit before you die. In 1991, the American Institute of Architects named it the best all-time work of American architecture. The Johnson Wax Headquarters Building, 1936, showing interior lily pad supports. Taliesin West, 1937, one of Frank's 2 personal homes later in life. He called all his homes Taliesin after a mythical Welsh magician. Monona Terrace, a convention center in Madison, Wisconsin. Designed in 1938, proposed to the county board, and rejected by 1 vote. The design was passed by referendum in 1992 and built in 1997, 59 years after Wright designed it. That's the Dorothy H. Turkle House, 1941. The Saul Friedman House, 1947. First Unitarian Society of Madison, 1949. And the Guggenheim Museum, 1959. I was there myself in 1984, and I clearly remember the long spiral ramp where you view the art. And believe me, I did not show them all. The internet has dozens more lovely buildings. Of course, it's even better if you have a chance to see one in person. If you're hearing this in Toronto, Buffalo has a number of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. Frank lived to the pretty good age of 91. I decided to end with a photo of him looking like a giant beside a model of the Guggenheim, because he is still a giant on the architectural landscape today and appears destined to remain so.